Okay, good morning everyone. Good morning everyone and welcome to this, Councillor Walker, good morning. Welcome to this, the final meeting of the Housing Planning and Environment Overview and Scrutiny Committee of this municipal year. We've had apologies this morning from Councillors Shamim Abdullah, Graham Whittam, Michael Winstanley, Lynn Holland, Laura Booth and Catherine Preston. And I'd like to say a big thank you to Councillor Fred Walker and Councillor Bernard Sharp, who are here as substitutes. Thank you very much indeed. We're expecting Councillor Tanya Birch as a substitute shortly, but we are quorate today. I want to say a special thanks to our subs because they have been better attendees than some of our permanent members. And so thank you very, very much to them for making sure that we have been quorate almost always and for making sure that these meetings can continue and function. So special thank you for for making the time to come over here and contribute to all these meetings.
Sorry, Chair, can I just...
Councillor Walker, by all means, please use your microphone.
Sorry, just a suggestion, but the other committees actually put the dates in our diaries. So I'm talking about substitutes now. So I know when they're coming up. So I should know if I wrote it down at the first meeting of the year, as long as I was there and wrote it down. But it's very handy to have that prompt in our diaries. And for some reason, this committee doesn't do it, but the other two do.
Okay.
So
thank you for that. Let's leave that with the Secretariat.
Because the longer warning you've got, the more chance you've got of keeping it free.
Understood. Thank you very much for that, Councillor Walker. Let's leave that with the Secretariat as a good suggestion. And if nothing else, uniformity across the three scrutiny committees seems to make some sense, doesn't it? Okay, Chair's announcements. The only thing from me is to confirm that the meeting of this committee that was initially planned for the 16th of May will not take place. That meeting is cancelled. That's mostly because all the districts will not have had their annual councils, and so we won't know who the new members of this committee are, there is no business that is urgent and is needed for that meeting. Item 3, no declarations of interest have been submitted. Does anybody have anything they need to declare? Okay, minutes of the last meeting then, item 4. 2 things just to comment on here. I want to thank the officers for what I thought was a really good meeting on transport innovation last time. I think some work had been done to bring in some interesting speakers. They'd been well prepared, and I thought that was a really useful session that we had that time, particularly on that subject. Just on that, we made a few recommendations to the Combined Authority and the Mayor as the transport portfolio holder of the Combined Authority. They were made at the last meeting, and the rules of the Combined Authority are that it has 2 months to respond to a recommendation. So we would expect those by our June meeting of this committee. It also is worth pointing out that recommendations we made back in January on the Clean Air Plan, we had Councillor Alex Gnottis here presenting the Clean Air Plan. We made a recommendation that the Combined Authority should look at whether particulates should be a topic that the 10 boroughs work together on. We haven't yet had a response to that. So that was due in March, and the committee secretariat have agreed to go and look into where that's up to, because we would hope that that comes through. On that basis, is it agreed that those minutes are a true record of the last meeting? Thank you very much. Okay, item 5 is GM housing strategy. We have a familiar face to members of this committee in City Mayor Paul Dennett. We could play bingo with sentences. We haven't yet heard from you about the vision and the strategy, but thank you for coming. You're a good attender at these committee meetings, and we do appreciate it. We have had the strategy in draft form, I think, before, haven't we? So you have been good enough to give us the background to to the workings of this and where this has come from. I think if you give us a few minutes of introduction on it, because of course we've all read it, maybe focus on any changes since the draft or any new additions to it. I think that would be useful. And then I'm sure members will have questions. Okay, please go ahead.
Sure, thank you very much, Chair. This is the Greater Manchester Housing Strategy. I don't think this committee has seen this in draft form to date. What you've seen is the housing vision, which has now been agreed by the Combined Authority. The housing vision, as colleagues will know, is a precursor for this more robust housing strategy for for Greater Manchester. I just want to start off by saying this document has been co-produced, so it's not just something that's coming from the executive of the combined authority. There have been writing groups undertaken, listening groups, and a whole range of different stakeholders have had input into this document to date, and that's illustrated at 1.2 in the report. Colleagues will also know that within the Greater Manchester strategy, the overarching strategy for the combined authority, there is a commitment there to building safe, decent and affordable housing, or ensuring we have safe, decent and affordable housing across Greater Manchester. And that very much sits at the heart of this strategy. It's about how do we operationalise that? What does that actually mean? What I would also say is that this is a comprehensive housing strategy, and what I mean by that is that it has a relationship with lots of other activity taking place within Greater Manchester across the combined authority. We don't see housing in isolation. In fact, we see housing very much at the heart of much broader issues across Greater Manchester, be they health, climate change, our CO2 reduction targets, tackling homelessness and rough sleeping, skills and work, and also the economy in light of the forthcoming local industrial strategy. It's also related to service transformation, and for me, housing is an essential foundation for work. So for us, it is related to how we deliver public services, health and social care, criminal justice, this whole idea of integration of place, and where does housing sit within all of that. Colleagues will be aware as well there's a clear relationship with the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, or what we commonly refer to now as the Greater Manchester Plan for Jobs, Homes and the Environment. And that is about building the right homes in the right place and also meeting our local housing need here within Greater Manchester. It's about community engagement, because you'll see within this documentation that there's a commitment to community-led housing. So it's not about just a one-size-fits-all sort of approach to delivering housing, not an over-reliance in some respects on the market. This is about empowering people to create the communities they want to create. It's about being sensitive to heritage and the public realm and cultural space and leisure, and how we do placemaking and how housing sits within a much broader context. For me, we've tried really hard to take an evidence-based approach to this. And when I talk about evidence-based approach, I don't mean just analysing the housing market. I mean looking at the interconnectedness here. Some of the big challenges you'll see throughout the document is things like affordability. And what we're committing to within this strategy is to undertake some significant work to actually understand what affordability is for the people of Greater Manchester. Affordability is often talked about as 80% of market value, but we know housing markets differ significantly up and down the country, and even here within Greater Manchester, and increasingly housing is becoming unaffordable for many, many people. There's also other big challenges you'll be aware of, and that's in many respects as a consequence of other commitments within the spatial framework, such as carbon neutrality by 2038. What does that mean for housing? Net zero carbon homes by 2028. We need to think about how we operationalise that within the context of this strategy. For me, though, I guess one of the things I'd like to draw your attention to is probably how we operationalise this, because I'm not a big fan, as you're probably aware, of strategies or policy documents that simply sit on the shelf. Because what matters is what you do. It's the agency of the strategy that really is important. So you'll see there, if looking at kind of new homes, we're looking at new delivery models across Greater Manchester, increasing choices, so making sure we are genuinely trying to meet need in terms of delivering housing numbers across Greater Manchester. And that includes a commitment, as you know, to social housing. Social housing, we've committed to 30,000 units over the period of the spatial framework. A further 20 will be affordable housing, and there's that 50,000 target now we've committed ourselves to try and tackle what is a broken housing market, which is acknowledged nationally by government as well. But it's also about delivering the homes we need, so thinking across different types. So we've been doing a lot of work with the Health and Social Care Partnership to understand supported accommodation needs across Greater Manchester. And it's also about looking at existing stock, which I have to say, I think is probably one of the biggest challenges we're going to face here within Greater Manchester moving forward in terms of meeting our ambitious carbon neutrality and net zero carbon home targets by the agreed dates, because ultimately that will depend on how we can raise the finance to actually retrofit those homes, which is going to be a huge challenge. It's also about better private rented sector. You know, for me, we've got significant issues. One of the biggest causes of homelessness within Greater Manchester is no-fault evictions from the private rented sector. Tackling standards and decency within that sector sits at the heart of this strategy. You'll be very familiar with the work we've been doing on rough sleeping and Andy's commitment to end the need for rough sleeping in Greater Manchester and the 10-year homelessness strategy. There's also some work in here as well you'll see around healthy housing services, and that's about providing housing services for people who need those services, but doing it in a joined up way across Greater Manchester, linking it with education, skills, opportunities for young people and other people within the labour market, and making sure that all our homes are safe, healthy and accessible. I'd finish on this. For me, this housing strategy cannot be delivered in isolation. It's not something that can be delivered by the combined authority on its own. So we see the enablers as absolutely critical to making things happen here in Greater Manchester. And those enablers for me are very much around partnerships and collaboration with the private sector, with the community and voluntary sector, with other local authorities and public bodies such as Homes England here in Greater Manchester. It's about taking a very much evidence-based data approach to this as well and making sure our analysis is kept up to date, and you'll see that through work on the spatial framework, the strategic housing assessment that underpinned a lot of that work. But it's also about changing national policy. So for me, some of this is about changing things at a national level and lobbying around areas of housing policy that we think need reform. So it is about garnering support around what we see as key enablers. So I'll finish on that, but I think this is the first time we've had a housing strategy in Greater Manchester. It's a fantastic achievement. This isn't a product of my own work. This is a product of everyone's contributions across Greater Manchester, and I'd like to put on record my thanks and gratitude to everyone who's actually participated and made this a possibility today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You're quite right. We have talked about the strategy, but we have never seen a draft of the strategy. You're quite right. We've talked about the formation of it. One point from me before I throw it open to colleagues for questions and comments is it talks in here about town centres in a way that I think is really welcome. One thing I think just in terms of language is talking about district centres as well, because across the 10 boroughs in Greater Manchester, yes, we've got some towns, but we've also got villages, and in local government speak, that's districts as well. And I think regenerating some of those would be really welcome, and making appropriate housing available in those district centres, which are the best areas typically served by public transport. They're the best areas for our ageing population so that they can walk to the shops. They don't need to get a bus to the shops. And I think just thinking about the language there as well as the strategy. So just, I don't know if you want to say anything about that before.
Yeah, no, I welcome that comment, and I absolutely accept that. I mean, I know from my own city we have a collection of townships, and you know, the whole town centre challenge has created some interesting tensions within the city around which one do you choose out of a whole collection of them. So I think I think it's a point well made, and we'll make sure we reflect that in the strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Robinson, I saw you first.
Thank you, Chair. I can't see in here anything regarding, well, because we're doing a review of the Section 21 notice on how it's affecting people, and I can't actually find it in here, or I've misread it somewhere. Is it in part of the draft on how we review it? I've been told we are reviewing it.
Just to respond to that, it might not be explicitly referenced in the strategy document, but it is very much in the implementation plan. That's already been raised with us on a number of occasions, the importance of tackling no-fault evictions, absolutely. So it's part of the private rented sector work within the implementation plan of the strategy.
Councillor Sharp, I've got you next, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I, as usual, hadn't seen these papers until I walked in, and I'm very grateful, if I may say so, for your explanation, which again has been emulated by the chair over here, that it's a lot more to do with other things other than just housing itself, and I do understand that. It's very, very important. I was just trying to look and glance at something which I find at the moment is being worked out by the planning and development aspects of the local authorities. Because I've been a member of a planning committee for many, many, many years. I actually am only a substitute now, but I have been a full member up to the previous year. And I find there's an awful lot of political domination to the decisions which are being made, which shouldn't be the case. I just hope, quite frankly, what you said and what's in these papers gets specifically to local authorities, which I'm sure it does, but it might just lie somewhere. It needs to get to the planning department and the managers of the planning department so that they can bring this into their policies and educate, if I may say so, the members of the planning committee. Otherwise, you immediately get a political group that will all vote one way. It may or may not be the right answer because every borough is different. There's all different social standings in the borough. You do need to have a bit of a mix here and there, not just one lot. So all I'm saying is the ideas are extremely good. Hopefully it will bed itself down where somebody seriously will look at it, those people within the local authorities that deal initially with this thing, which is usually the planning department when I think about it. So it's just a general comment. Forgive me if I've been talking off my own views because I haven't read the papers, but that's how I'm just feeling at the moment.
Do you want to respond to that? And I think perhaps it would be interesting for all the committee to learn about how this has been put together with the 10 boroughs. I think that would be, to Councillor Sharp's point.
So in terms of the engagement of planning leads across the 10 districts, we absolutely have engaged planning leads in the consultation around what we've got now in terms of the draft housing strategy. So that's the officers. In terms of what has happened politically, we've asked for the leads to come forward to participate in this in terms of the writing groups and the work that's taken place around this. But that's a choice for the district. So what I can't categorically say here is that we've absolutely had the planning leads from every single 10 district participating in all of the work, but ultimately that is a choice for the districts. For me though, we need to not see this in isolation from everything else that's taking place, because districts will have their own housing strategies as well. At a local level, you'll have your own local plans or core strategies. This is very much a kind of hub and spoke model. What we're trying to do is create more value by collaborating and working together at a Greater Manchester level where that fits, and where that fits for districts across Greater Manchester. And the housing strategy speaks to that, and it tries to speak to that in an evidence-based way. So just to provide reassurance, we have engaged politicians that have been obviously put forward to engage with this process, and we have engaged the planning leads within the districts around the draft.
I've got Councillor Gunther next, please.
This is a very commendable document, a very ambitious document, and one that I'm sure we would all support. What does bother me though is infrastructure. I know within my own authority, and I'm sure this applies I'm sure this applies to other authorities as well, where there are current planning applications in for numerous houses, in some cases quite big developments, but where there is no apparent ability to include infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I mean medical, doctors, schools, and so on, and of course as well as the actual roads. I would also want to come on to, and I know I think I'm harping on about it, but I would also want to make reference to rough sleeping. This is something I do, and I know you feel very deep, and I'm sure we all feel very deeply about. In one of the minutes in a previous meeting, it does recognise that rough sleeping in some cases is a way of life. I also think this needs to be investigated. I also feel that the situation could be assisted if more cubicle accommodation could be provided to rough sleepers rather than the current dormitory. I know that comes down to finances, but I do think serious consideration needs to be given to, having spoken to rough sleepers, serious consideration needs to be given to that. Thank you.
I think the point you make around infrastructure is a point well made. I mean, we probably could debate for a long time about whether the planning process or the planning function delivers enough funding for Greater Manchester for the purposes of infrastructure. I was struck by an article in Place Northwest only the other day that talked about Section 106 contributions towards infrastructure requirements in 17-18, and for Greater Manchester it was calculated at £15.7 million. Now, that may sound a lot of money, but in terms of the infrastructure requirements we need across Greater Manchester, it's an absolute drop in the ocean. And what that highlights to me is that quite clearly through the planning process, we're not going to raise the level of infrastructure funding we absolutely need in here in Greater Manchester. Which brings me to my other point. Colleagues will know that government have played hardball with us really around the housing deal. They've said to us quite categorically, unless we commit to a larger local housing number, they will not be giving us the £50 million worth of land remediation fund we need within Greater Manchester, and they'll not be giving us the £8 million worth of revenue we need to build that place-based team here within Greater Manchester. Now, these are ongoing conversations with government at the moment, but absolutely share your concerns around infrastructure. Greater Manchester needs significant levels of infrastructure across a whole raft of different areas. I'm not optimistic that the planning system in and of itself will deliver the level of funding we need. Why? Because we have significant viability issues here within Greater Manchester in terms of, post-industrial city region, brownfield remediation costs, land assembly costs, associated infrastructure with all of that are significant, which play out increasingly when we're asking developers for contributions towards infrastructure. However, what I do believe is having a Greater Manchester spatial framework and a housing strategy and an infrastructure framework, which is a precursor for a strategy forthcoming at some point in the near future, is the best place for us to be in to actually lobby government for the much needed investment that historically we have not seen here within Greater Manchester. So I guess what I'm saying is let's use this as a tool to lobby for more investment in infrastructure. On the issue of rough sleeping, I mean, I'm quite clear, no one should feel the need to sleep rough on our streets, and it's absolutely our moral and ethical duty to do all we can to provide people with accommodation within Greater Manchester. I think colleagues within the room will realise that A Bed Every Night has been a phenomenal success within Greater Manchester, and in a sense the city region is leading the way in terms of tackling rough sleeping here within Greater Manchester. I do accept the point that sometimes people do choose to sleep rough on the streets, but that's their personal choice. What we need to do is reassure ourselves that there is enough accommodation for absolutely everyone, so nobody needs to sleep rough on our streets here in Greater Manchester. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Brownridge, please.
Thank you. I'd also like to welcome this. I think it's a fantastic piece of work, and I really welcome the fact that housing's not being looked at in isolation. It's embedded into all the other factors that go to making a life. Having said that, because of that, it's an extremely long and complicated document, and I wonder if it's possible to take out the evidential base into a technical appendix so that the actual strategy focuses on what we're doing. The justification for it's there to be looked at if people need to, but we're focusing on what we're planning to do. I think my other two comments are I'd like to see some more overt and explicit commitment to quality in the houses we're building, because obviously anybody on planning committees knows we're getting applications for rabbit hutches in all the time now for tiny little houses. So I think we need to have a very clear commitment to good quality space standards and quality of actual construction. And the other point's about brownfield. Whilst I realise brownfield is very often suitable for housing if we can get the remediation, It's also some cases where it should not be developed because it's very often in very densely developed areas, and it should be actually undeveloped in order to create that improved environment that the document refers to. So whether that can be made more explicit, I don't know, but I think it's important that there's a very big focus on brownfield, and everybody thinks, oh, all the brownfield is going to be developed, and that might not be the most appropriate thing.
There was a lot in that. It's all right. It is long and complicated, and I guess I don't entirely apologise for that, because I do think housing is actually a complicated issue, and if we oversimplify it, I think we miss an opportunity to think systemically about this. In terms of the evidence base, we have actually had a debate on this issue, and I was really keen to incorporate the evidence base to encourage people to actually read it, because for me, what's really, really important is that people don't just feel as though we've just sat around a table or discussed this and come up with these proposals. It's based on an analysis and an understanding of what's actually happening here in Greater Manchester. My fear, I guess, if we just add it into an appendix as a technical appendix, then there is a potential that people won't read that. And, you know, there's some really shocking statistics and data that I do want to draw people's attention to, really, in the evidence base, because I think it's really important we have a detailed understanding about why we're doing this and why we're bringing forward a Greater Manchester housing strategy. I think the points on quality are well made, and we have been looking at other districts across Greater Manchester that have been doing quite a bit of work on this in terms of space standards, construction, and also responding to things like modern methods of construction as well, and how we take that forward potentially within Greater Manchester. The GMSF also has a policy that all new build obviously will meet the required new space standards, so that is actually specified within the spatial framework already. The point that you make around land is a point that I think is really well made and often not thought about, really, because for me, we should be thinking about public utility here at the end of the day. You know, what pieces of land derive benefits for people, and we should seek to do all we can to protect those. If that's brownfield, if that's mixed land use or greenfield or greenbelt, then, you know, obviously we need to look at how we actually approach land across the whole of Greater Manchester, because part of our ambition, as you all know, is to green the urban environment. It's almost about how do we bring the green belt throughout Greater Manchester and create green environments everywhere for people to enjoy. I'm often reminded in my city that, you know, life expectancy between the urban kind of concrete part of the city and the greener part of the city, the difference is 10 years. So doing something on that is absolutely critical if we're going to be improving people's health and well-being and just general quality of life here in Greater Manchester. So I do think it's a point that's well made, and we should probably consider that further around how we embed public utility in terms of land allocation and land use. Thanks.
Councillor Walker, you're next, please.
I'm the world's worst, aren't I? Welcome the report. One of the things that feels like it's missing, but I mean, I think the starting point is anyone who's on this committee cares passionately about housing. But we all, and I think most politicians, recognise that housing's a basic building block to all the other things. But I would have liked to have seen, even if it's only in passing, a mention of education, because without decent housing, education doesn't really work, you know, for the poorest members of our community. So, you know, I want to make it more rounded, if you like, and that's the only point that I'm making there. Can I just say as well that one of the things that does happen, and I'm, you know, in my borough in particular, which is Wigan, but everywhere, is that brownfield sites often become, to the public, greenfield sites. You know, when a site stood empty and got a bit of wildlife on it, and a few people have, you know, started doing allotments on it and all the other things, then that so-called brownfield site becomes, you know, very relevant. And quite often those sites are in the areas where, you know, there's more poverty around. So I just think that there's a trick here that we need to take into consideration when we're looking at these things. But can I just, because my concern is, and I'm doing it from a borough that's got more, I mean, we've got loads of brownfield sites, we've got old pit sites, like there's no tomorrow. But I'd still know how controversial it is, and how, particularly at election time, you know, discussing any site with a view to putting some housing in it can be a nightmare. But I am worried about the issue of affordability. And I know that can mean a million things, and that was the point that you made. But I'm just wondering how much of a sign-up we've got, because the most influential people in this are probably the leaders of councils. And if it's great for us to have a policy about it, but it only works if, you know, everybody signs up to it. And I don't just mean in principle, I mean, you know, that they're going to start delivering pretty soon, not in 20 years' time. You know, I'll pass anything that says 20 years' time. So I just wonder what likely sign-up we're going to get and how honest it will be on this question of affordability. You know, we just don't, I think it's just saying in Wigan, apart from when we've perhaps got an issue of getting a big chunk of infrastructure. Other than that, we never, you know, give in on our affordability issues. There's got to be the 25% affordability. But I keep on, every time I open the evening news, I'm reading about where we've given in elsewhere in the borough, in the conurbation.
Sorry, Councillor Robinson, did you have a point specifically following up on Councillor Walker? It's a separate one. Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Walker. On the point around education, absolutely, and we'll look at making that more explicit within the document. I guess where I saw that is very much within the kind of skills and work, apprenticeships, how we can use the housing market as an opportunity to provide employment opportunities, apprenticeships and traineeships, all those sorts of things. But yeah, let's make it more explicit within the document, no problem with that at all. In terms of brownfield sites, it's kind of reiterating the point that was made earlier. What I would say, though, is obviously what's important in all of this is your own local plans and core strategies, and also decisions taken within the district's planning committee around what you do with pieces of land that you feel have significant public utility, and any other relevant policy documents you may operate locally is very much the space for considering some of this, as well as through obviously the Greater Manchester Housing Strategy. On the issue of affordability, I think there's two elements to that. I mean, you're generally worried about affordability, I understand that. And then also there's the issue of how much of housing is affordable when development actually comes forward on sites. Again, that is a matter for local plans. And I know in my city, we zone the whole of the city, and certain parts have certain thresholds that they have to meet in terms of affordability requirements. We're out to consult on that. I think the broader point around affordability, though, maybe it'd be worth us coming back to this committee when the work that's undertaken by ARC4 is completed, who are looking at some detailed work on defining affordability and affordable housing here within Greater Manchester. Be more than happy to bring that to this committee for us to discuss further. I don't really want to comment too much at this stage, other than I know there's a chronic undersupply at the moment of truly affordable housing when you look at house price rises over the last 2 decades, and when you look at what's been happening with wages. Home ownership is increasingly out of reach. People are increasingly forced into the private rented sector, and you know, often paying significant proportions of their income to actually just put a roof over their heads. So absolutely with you on challenging what's going on there, but I guess for me, I'm just awaiting this evidence base undertaken by ARC4. Happy to bring that back to this committee at a future date to have further conversations around how we tackle the affordability crisis within the housing market within Greater Manchester. Thank you.
Okay, I've got Councillors Robinson, then Clay, then Morgan, and then I think we'll draw a line under this item. Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. It's 2 points. The first one, I think the councillor from Bury wasn't at a previous meeting where I brought up about the health and safety of young women that are homeless going into overnight accommodation. And I had brought that up at a previous meeting, that there should be separate accommodation for females so they're not vulnerable within a mixed group. We are now looking at one particular building in Rochdale where we're going to try and do a segregation so that females that are vulnerable feel they have a place to go. On the other issue on infrastructure, if anybody wants it to have any information, it's took a number of years, but Junction 19 of the M62, it's took us a long time to get that sorted. We are having houses built there, but not just that. We need a school, so we're going to be getting a school, a doctor's, and I'm not sure, I think we're going to be having a small shopping development. And on that, the reason it's being done all across Junction 19, because the infrastructure on the A58 through Hayward is so congested that there's a lot of damage being done to the infrastructure that's already there. So this will take out the lorries coming through the A58 onto the slip road, but onto not just to the industrial estate, but on top of that, we've been told that now Hayward has got a growing population and has got no school places. So as part of the housing need for that area, we have also put in there schools, a doctor's, and an infrastructure of maybe a shopping centre. So that has now all been passed, and sometime in the future, once it's up and running, I'm hoping that will help other authorities that are having a struggle might want to look at that. And on the last point, on your rug, I'd like to I welcome the report from that rug review.
Okay. On the issue of segregation, thanks for letting us know what's happening in Rochdale. It is very much part of our thinking in terms of tackling rough sleeping and homelessness here in Greater Manchester. I haven't got the latest data in terms of the number of units that are segregated based on gender, but I can get that information to you, no problem at all. I'll speak with Mike Wright following this meeting in connection with that. On infrastructure, be delighted to have a look at how you've managed to do it. I guess the size of the development site has some sort of bearing on how much infrastructure investment you've been able to realise there. On schools as well, one of the things I'm aware of is if we are building new schools to access capital from national government, they have to be free schools. And I know that's something that a lot of local authorities at a local level have opposed. So, you know, there are tensions inevitably in here. It's not just about delivering a school, it's about what type of school you end up delivering if you're accessing national capital to do some of this. And yeah, happy to come along and have a look at that when that's all up and running. I suspect it will take a little bit of time, but thank you.
Yeah, some of the rules around councils not being able to open new schools has led to some very large schools in the area I represent, which isn't right for all children. I think that's safe to say. Councillor Clay, you were next on my list, please.
Thank you, Chair. I do welcome the report. I think there's a lot of hard work has gone into it from many different people. I just start with a quick comment. I noticed you mentioned Grenfell in the Hackett review, and I think when we have a housing strategy that's based in large part upon building tall apartment buildings in the centre of Manchester, I saw with some dismay and anxiety the plans to reduce fire service cover for Greater Manchester. So I'm sure that's something that people will all be returning to at a later date. Looking on at the content here and some of the strategy we're proposing, I think it's great to see some talk about interventions in the private rented sector and the lowest kind of quality that we see in the poor parts of the private rented sector. I'm just wondering what we're doing to get additional powers devolved to the Greater Manchester region, and obviously part of the devolution deal, we'd hope to be able to get full landlord registration or full landlord licensing, and possibly things like suspension of the right to buy, which I know Sadiq Khan is asking for now, and they have already done in Wales and Scotland. So yeah, those are two things we'd be interested in. Can we get those sorts of powers devolved to Greater Manchester? And in terms of the building of the new homes, more control locally over investments from the Homes England, so we can build more social housing, whether it's council or housing association. It's all going to require a lot of grant funding, and if there's any prospect of any more of that coming to us. So welcome many things in the report, and I know there's a lot more to do to deliver some of this strategy. Also, the stuff on retrofitting is very interesting as well, so be looking forward to seeing more about that in the future.
Great, thank you very much, Councillor Clay. I think you're absolutely right to highlight the work following Grenfell and obviously the inquiry that's still ongoing and the Hackett review. And we're still not in a position to be able to say what exactly the building regulations are, because government, as you know, have accepted the recommendations in full, but what they've done is further consulted on those recommendations in terms of implementation. And then we've got the perennial challenge around getting legislation through the Commons and the Lords at the moment because of Brexit. But yes, I think this will be very much a kind of moving feast, really, in terms of what this will mean for building regulations moving forward. And you are absolutely right to highlight, you know, the high density in the urban core of Greater Manchester, and how making sure that fire safety is very much at the heart of whatever we do here in Greater Manchester, and that is very much part of our thinking today. And as you know, I chair the High Rise Task Force on behalf of the combined authority, regularly liaising and interacting with partners, stakeholders, and also the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government on all of that. But I think this is we're going to have to be revisiting, I think, the housing strategy or the implementation plan as things develop nationally around building regulations and what that means for cladding systems moving forward. Interventions in the private rented sector. Additional powers. Now, this is something definitely we want to explore through the implementation plan. As you know, at the moment, landlord licensing is restricted to 20% of a local authority area, unless the Secretary of State agrees to go beyond that. There are examples up and down the country where whole local authority areas have been landlord licensed, and that is something, if leaders across Greater Manchester are willing, we can explore through this housing strategy, no problem at all. On the suspension of right to buy, I have had dialogue with housing ministers on this issue, and they're quite firm in terms of their position that they're not going to suspend right to buy at the moment here in Greater Manchester. However, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do more work around that and lobby and campaign on that issue. And I have asked for more work to be undertaken on trying to understand the money around right to buy since 1980, because as you'll know, when people exercise the right to buy, they accrue a discount. Some of the money is then returned to the Treasury centrally, and some of that money sits within housing revenue accounts within districts. Some of that is spent, some of that is unspent. But I think taking a strategic and a holistic approach within GM to understanding right to buy further than what our understanding is telling us at the moment, with a view to ideally suspending it at least, if not scrapping it, in my opinion, then yeah, absolutely, let's collaborate around that agenda. In terms of more control locally over Homes England, I think colleagues will be aware of some of the methodological complexities that sit behind some of the allocations that Homes England obviously control on behalf of the government. It is deeply, deeply frustrating that, you know, 80% of the money they control is going into London and the South East generally, and we've done a lot of work around this, and colleagues will have seen the paper around that. But you're absolutely right, we need to continue to challenge Homes England. I mean, government have committed to, I think it's 12,500 social rented properties outside of the City of London by 2022, I think is the date. I want to know where every single one of those properties are being built outside of the City of London, and how much money is being used through Homes England's kind of various funds to obviously support that. We need more of that in Greater Manchester, and that's why really I'm interested in it. But I do think there's going to be a big conversation about Green Book appraisals, benefit cost ratios, how they play out, how they don't work generally for the north of the conurbation, and we will be campaigning, I think, on some of those issues in the very near future and working with colleagues. Homes England, in a sense, are caught between a rock and a hard place, aren't they? Because they're an agency of the government. They're doing the work on behalf of the Treasury and the Ministry, and they're working with us locally to try and enact our strategies, policies, plans and targets. So I acknowledge that. Thank you.
And Councillor Morgan for our last contribution.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick one. You touched on it, Paul, about viability and deliverability, really, of proposals. We're all at our planning authorities. They come forward with the correct 106 monies and they get their application passed, and then for it to come back a couple of months later and say, oh, we can't afford to do it now, you're going to have to cut your 106 monies. But the pressure on us all as local authorities is we need the houses. So we're stuck between a rock and a hard plate because we have in past sacrificed the 106 monies, lost all the infrastructure investment to keep building the houses, which we'll obviously all be pressurised to do. How can this strategy support us all in our boroughs to have a robust challenge process about viability and deliverability?
Really good question, and clearly there are variances across Greater Manchester. There are variances because of austerity and local government cuts. You know, our planning, regeneration, housing teams in some of the districts have been absolutely decimated since 2010, and there isn't the resource there in some of the districts. Where we do seem to have resources within Greater Manchester is where you have vibrant housing markets, so where there's a lot of activity, where there's a lot of development. And I know that tends to be at the moment very much in the south of the conurbation. So I do believe that through collaboration through this, working with colleagues within the combined authority in terms of the housing and planning team, we are in a better position to develop that resource, that expertise, to have these strategic conversations around viability. Absolutely. It's about all pulling together in what are really challenging and difficult times, because you'll be aware that the worst case scenario of all of this is not having a plan at all, because not having a plan at all means development comes forward anywhere in your districts because you've got to demonstrate your 5-year supply of housing. And if you can't do that, then the system as it stands currently will never find in your favour. So collaboration does sit at the heart of this, and I think working with colleagues in the combined authority, getting a better understanding of viability issues, and we've already been doing some of this with things like the forward fund bids we've been submitting into government, the marginal viability funds we've submitted on behalf of GM. That was very much a collective approach, and we've been relatively successful to date with some of that, helping us do some of the brownfield remediation, doing some of the infrastructure work. It's about doing more of that. Government seemed clear. It is about housing numbers. You'll be aware of their manifesto target. 300,000 homes per year by the mid-2020s is what they're trying to deliver. So everything is geared towards delivering that number for the government. What we've got to make sure we do is it's not just a numbers game for us. It's about delivering the right homes in the right places and making sure we try and build as many truly affordable housing to meet need that we possibly can. But I do believe through this work and through the implementation plan and all of the work today and all the one public estate work and everything that goes on, we are stronger together, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We'll draw a line under that item because we've got plenty more to go at. Thank you very much for that. Item 6, the Smart Energy Plan, and we're joined by Sean Owen, who is a member of the GM Environment team. He has slides for us. Contain your excitement, everyone. Please go ahead and take maybe 10 minutes or so to introduce it using your slides, and then I'm sure the committee will have plenty of questions.
Thank you, Chair. As introduced there, I've been asked to present the Smart Energy Plan for you, and just to bring to your awareness, the plan was written by Energy Systems Catapult in conjunction with GMCA and Electricity North West and a number of other groups from across Greater Manchester feeding into this. The plan aims to set out a region-wide carbon neutral vision, which is based on the Springboard report and the 2018 Green Summit. I say that because the report here that I'm presenting today was written in November 2018, so it's just to bear in mind that it is a couple of months since it was first written. It will highlight the challenges that GM faces, some of which you will have already seen as part of the 5-year environment plan, which was presented at the last group. It will highlight priority areas, propose strategic activity, and equally propose a 5-year roadmap, a roadmap which will keep us on trajectory towards a 2038 carbon neutral target. However, it will also reference the fact that it is a very challenging target that we have for 2038. The vision is taken from, as I've just alluded to, the Springboard report and the Green Summit from 2018. The GM challenge, which is critical and key to all of us, we'll all know this and understand this from the work that's been completed from the spatial framework and Springboard report from before. You will pick up on the fact that energy there is 72% of our energy consumed within buildings, both domestic and non-domestic, so quite pertinent to the conversation we've just had now regarding new build and going forward. The growth forecast there was originally written as 2035 because, again, the report was from November before updates were provided. But the key factor there is we've got 211,000 new homes potentially coming forward, which is only going to add greater increase on our energy demand within the sector and across the conurbation. Continue to add that with the need for greater uptake of industrial space. It is only going to lead to an even larger increase on energy consumption. So 3% if we don't actually build in the need for energy efficiency across the piece as well. Low carbon transport will also need to be factored in. And again, there's been many reports from TFGM and a roadmap and a 2040 plan. But this plan tries to bring together all of those different factors to show as the Smart Energy Plan as a whole system approach. So from a background perspective, it's just clear it needs to be made clear that this is taking a national approach and bringing it down to place-based. So what is relevant for GM? So at the top right there, we have two scenarios taken from the National Grid Future Energy Scenarios, one being business as usual, we just follow national policy, and the other one being a more community-led approach. That approach is then fed into what is classed as the regional approach here, which was Scatter, a model funded by BEIS and worked with the GM Environment team and other partners to deliver 4 pathways. More recently, those pathways have been refined, and it's very clear that at the very bottom there, it's not abundantly clear on the presentation, but scenario 4 is the closest one that gets us to a 2038 target. The reality shows us that we will not get to that point using current business as usual or current technologies. So we do need an awful lot more innovation to come forward. But there are things we can do now and over the next 5 years to facilitate that. At the bottom right-hand corner there, we have detail taken from a Energy Path Networks demonstration carried out in Bury. This looks at how Bury as a conurbation, as a district, could meet the challenge for low carbon neutrality. First and foremost on the left-hand side using national targets of 2050, and then more recently bringing that to 2040, the closest we could get to 2038. The clear denominations there is that most of our energy consumption and carbon comes from buildings and or transport. So they're the 2 key factors that we need to reduce. If we add into that and break that down, actually most of it comes from heating as well as transport. If we wanted to meet the 2040 target, we'd obviously have to accelerate that significantly. So decarbonisation of heat across our estates, both public, private, commercial, industrial, is critical. But it's how we accelerate that going forward. So the proposed regional principles is that we take a whole holistic approach, and we start with generation and storage, because if we are going to move away from fossil fuels, i.e. gas at this moment in time, we would need to electrify. That means that we need to complete and install more generation storage capability. We need to decarbonise heat across both process industry and spatial heating. We need to increase the uptake of low carbon transport, which is reflected in the 2040 transport plan. And then to marry all of that together, to close the loop, we need more diversity and flexibility. Because as we place these assets online, they're only going to provide greater stress on the system. Electricity North West are very clear that their system within the locality is robust. However, if we then start to put all of these different technologies in one location and they all get switched on at the same time, that's going to be stress tested somewhat. How is this going to be delivered? Well, it needs to be delivered through collaboration that leads to inclusion. So it does need industry, it does need academia, public, it needs the community. But more importantly, we need more of the bright ideas. We need more research in order to drive forward innovation. As key areas within the plan, it highlights that there are things that we need to do, or we can do. So at strategy level, we have a spatial framework, we have a transport plan, we have a local industrial strategy. We have trialled local area energy planning within Bury, but the concept is that, or the proposal is that needs to be expanded across the conurbation now, so that we can then greater inform future decisions. We need more innovation, so it's alluding to an energy transition region, which is effectively a large innovation zone, using Greater Manchester's boundaries as that and playing to the skill sets that we've got. We've got some fantastic academies, we've got some fantastic businesses, we've got some fantastic universities, but bring all of that together, and through that we can then drive forward and provide market confidence. We need to create a pipeline which demonstrates to the market and equally to everybody around this room that we actually have the ability and robust opportunities to take forward to delivery. We require a delivery mechanism. It's been mooted as an energy innovation company and or an energy company of past. but a delivery vehicle is required to take forward those projects which are otherwise stalled. And then to optimise all of that, the potential for a local energy market, currently only being trialled in Cornwall with Centrica, but it's dealing with different constraints. But if we were to put all of these things together, we have the ability then to move to 2038, is what the report is setting out. Finally, just to give an idea, the roadmap which the plan and the report moves towards, again focused on the 4 priority areas on the left with 5-year minimum goals. On the right-hand side, the minimum goals are alluding to, at the time of writing, 15 megawatts of generation and storage, 3.4 terawatt hours of heat, 200,000 low-carbon vehicles, and 15 megawatts of diverse load. The reality is since this report has been written, those figures have moved on somewhat. We're possibly looking more towards 45 megawatts of generation required above and beyond what we have now, 10.2 terawatt hours of heating, and circa 40 megawatts of diverse load. That's just for those 4 priority areas there. At the bottom, I've alluded to local energy planning already, but equally we need to take a view as GM, as a conurbation, on how do we see hydrogen playing a part within the future transition to low carbon. Is it likely that it's going to be used for off-grid areas or heavy industry or equally heavy haulage? But we need to take a view as we take that forward in time. Just to give an idea, some of those numbers do seem quite high and daunting, and what do they mean? If I was to pick on the heating one there, if we were to move towards a 10.2 terawatt hour requirement across heating and domestic use, etc., if I just picked on heat pumps, that's 150,000 heat pumps which would need to be installed within Greater Manchester by 2023-24. Nationally, we only install 30,000, so I'm just picking on one technology there. This is technology agnostic. So within there are an awful lot of different means and methods, but they're examples of what could be done. To pick on the examples, there are a number of projects already taking place across Greater Manchester, which are moving towards delivering some of those outputs there. Electricity North West have got various items in operation currently. Procure Plus are leading on a Homes as Energy Systems, which is ERDF funded, and circa £10 million. That commenced earlier this year and will deliver across 3 districts and deliver 600 heat pumps and various items into homes. It will test how we can move that model forward. Salford University have got the Energy House 1 and the Energy House 2 coming forward as we speak now. Manchester Metropolitan University have got the Fuel Cell Centre of Excellence. So there's lots of different projects there which are taking place now, but it's how can we maximise those and take those forward in a formulated manner. And more importantly, do it with inclusion and collaboration. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I thought this was a really interesting report. I was a little surprised not to see more mention of hydro generation of power, because near my house in Stockport there is Stockport Hydro, which is a community-run facility of 2 turbines just on the River Goyt, which produces an amount of energy. But I was interested in what you were saying about a community-based approach. So I wonder if you could talk, we've got plenty of rivers in Greater Manchester. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and how you see hydro fitting in here, but also a little bit more about how the community projects and how this being community-led approach would sit alongside one another.
So on the generation storage approach there, I'm actually meeting with a hydro company at 2 o'clock this afternoon for elements down in Salford, and I am aware of the one in Stockport. There are and have been a number of hydro approaches from community investment companies. Unfortunately, they can never make the model quite work because the removal of feed-in tariffs and different rates which would have supported them. That said, as we move forward, the trick here is about the innovation piece. How can we come up with new finance mechanisms to support them? How can we use our public estates potentially, if they're local to a river and local to one of these potential investment opportunities, how can we possibly purchase energy from that direct community source? It doesn't have to be just hydro, it can be PV, it can be battery, it can be any number of different opportunities. But there's a role to play. It's not my role to say that we, GM and or the district should do these things, but they should, in my view, should be reviewed as an opportunity and provide the opportunity to take that forward. And sometimes it's just a case of we need to enter a power purchase arrangement in that locality to take the energy and give them a means of selling the energy generated. That could be just the simple answer to getting that over the line. However, there are many other environmental issues we need to take into account. Water flow, the fish stocks within the area. We also need to take into account whether there's any further damage. But that should all be taken in the round and the whole.
Thank you. Any questions or comments on this report and presentation? Councillor Clay, you caught my eye first.
Thank you, Chair. I won't on this occasion bore you with the details of Labour Party policy making on this issue. But one of the things that's, you know, apparent is that we've got this target for 2038. You're saying it's not our role to say we should do this, but basically if we don't have some fairly rapid behavioural changes and changes in how power is generated and the efficiency with which we use it or waste it, then we're never going to get near those targets. One of the things that has been mentioned is retrofitting of properties. What can we do now in terms of bringing forward proposals in our authorities to do that? And is there any funding available from GM at the present time to support that sort of activity? And secondly, just batteries, which apparently are very important in storing the energy that we're going to make from all these recyclables that we haven't invested in yet. So a little bit about that, please.
So, thank you, Councillor Clay. To pick up your first point about retrofit, do we have any money within GM? I'm not apparently aware of any. However, there are different funds coming out from BEIS and from UKRI, which each individual organisation should be looking at and looking to make best use of. I am participating or in the process of bringing together a potential consortia which is operated with Energy Systems Catapult, which may look to bid in for £15 million to support heat pumps being delivered into domestic properties. The view being that that might be between 500 and 1,000 in the first instance within Greater Manchester. It's a small number, but the key point is the enabler that makes that happen. It is developing the new value sharing propositions which entice people to take one on board. There are other funds available. RHI is readily available, and that's available for ALMOs, RSLs, individual domestic users, and or public local authorities. So a lot of people take the view that they should be putting gas boilers in. Don't get me wrong, they are substantially cheaper. However, if we want to make the real step change, we should be looking at what are the alternatives. RHI can support the bridging of the gap, but it's mindful that RHI pays back, or Renewable Heat Incentive pays back over a number of years. So the business case has to be viable. And unfortunately, when you put in that final term, number of business cases fall by the wayside because they feel it is not viable because they do not wish to have that debt on the cost book. Can I just ask what your second question was, just to be clear? Sorry.
So I've been told by people who know a lot more about it than me that when we have all this renewable energy generated, we need to store it using batteries so that it doesn't get wasted and we can use it at times of peak demand or sell it on at times of peak demand if we're generating it.
Sorry, thank you for clarifying that. Battery storage, unfortunately at this moment in time, every number that I've personally looked at for a domestic property indicates that you would have to have something north of 4 kilowatts of install and something around 6 to 10 kilowatts of battery. It simply doesn't pay back at a domestic level currently unless it is at a aggregated level. So if I was an RSL or a public body and I was able to time shift energy, it may become viable at that point. However, the cost of battery is significantly dropping and it's something that we should be factoring in. If we can make use of Innovate UK funding or UKRI to bridge that gap and or ERDF, which was launched on Monday, it's certainly an opportunity for local authorities and wider to make best use of that technology now and become a pioneer as opposed to a follower. There are other means of storing energy. You can do it through water buffer vessels and so forth. So battery is the one that everybody talks about. There are other methods. So when I refer to generation and storage, there are plenty or a plethora of measures out there which can accommodate that.
Okay, I've got Councillor Robinson next, please.
Thank you, Chair. At the end of the day, we as councillors will get approached by residents. It's all right saying we need to be carbon free, but all people are interested in is how their bills, are they going to go up or are they going to go down?
This is very true, hence why I'm working with Energy Systems Catapult to understand the value sharing propositions. Some technologies may, under current tariffs, increase the cost for a resident, and that's what we need to be mindful of. However, if we can establish a value sharing proposition which is able to be better utilised, i.e. the technologies that are installed are not just simply there for heating, they're there for providing other services, the bill could actually come down. It's getting that scale. The NADO project, which was completed across 3 districts a couple of years ago, was the largest of its kind at the time, and still is the largest in Europe as far as I'm aware. That gave an example that we could actually do lots of different things behind the meter, which the bill payer would simply see a bill which had, here's a payment for these services. Unfortunately, at the moment, regulation doesn't allow, and we have to do it in an innovation environment. It will only be a matter of time where they are more readily available. The vision is we should be able to have something ready for early next year if the bid is successful.
Councillor Walker, please.
This report does seem to take a hopeful view about the future and future technologies. And clearly that seems to be a likelihood. For instance, electric cars, who cared about them 5 years ago, and now everyone's looking for, and that piece that we had at the last meeting about the future of some of the transport brought it home to me how the world's moving. But one of the big lessons that I did learn in the past about incentives was when we had a particularly attractive tariff for using solar panels on roofs. And due to it, we can put a load of solar panels on our south-facing council houses. Loads and loads of them. And when you go into our estates today, you see them. And actually, as well as reducing the bills for our residents, it also generates some money for Wigan Council. So, and I know that there was always sort of things that went wrong with all these things, because there always is when you're introducing new things. But it does seem to me that part of our campaign has to be saying to government, we need incentives, because for the number that we did in our houses, there was a lot of private sector out there who also did them in theirs, just based on saving money. So all I'm really saying is that part of our challenge is to really push government to give us some incentives, because the capital investment is always the killer with all these things. And the other dilemma I've got is when do you jump? Because it almost feels like, well, wait a minute, if I wait another year, there'll be an even better bit of technology. And I just wonder if you've got any thoughts on that.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. We're always lobbying BEIS. There's always somebody from the team or from the wider combined authority talking with different government departments, and not just with those, but also with energy providers. You may have noticed recently that was an energy provider that, as feed-in tariff was removed, announced an export tariff. So the market is starting to fill some of those gaps. However, there are a number of market failures. Where the technology is becoming more and more readily available and commercially viable, we need to look at different finance mechanisms. So we need to, in the instance of putting it on the RSL estates, unfortunately the days of being able to give the energy to the tenants for free is no longer there, it's no longer viable. But that doesn't mean we have to give it to them at an extortionate rate where there's no value sharing proposition in it for anybody. So we can still power purchase arrangements with the tenants. needs us to look differently at different commercial arrangements, different legal entities, and how we take that forward. As the new technologies come forward, however, such as heat pumps and so on and so forth, new to the UK, they've been widely available across the globe for many, many years. Again, the same approach needs to be taken. We need to make the most of the feed-in tariffs and the incentives that are available now, but then use those to understand what the new mechanisms could be and start to trial them, as opposed to waiting for the cliff edge, feed-in tariff is gone, all stop, what do we do, we've missed the boat. Some districts have been much better than others at taking that view, but it's something that we need to do as a combined authority, as a group of 10 districts. And we need to come forward with a proposition for our respective residents and tenants that they've got a view and value of, that we've tested it and we've tried it. Does that assist in helping?
With government, that's not an issue. You know, I'm sure the people you're speaking to agree with you, but making it more publicly aware that that's part of, has to be any future deal, probably it's part of politics, but one way or another we have to influence future governments to help us to help ourselves. That's the simple point I was making, and I think you recognise it.
Councillor Sadler, please, you were next.
Yes, while I've been listening to everybody, one of the things that worries me, and I might be right off base with this, our energy providers are all private now, and most of them owned by foreign companies. How are you going to persuade them to go along with this, put money into the infrastructure to do what we're expecting them to do? Is it harder because there's so many of them, and like I say, so many foreign countries involved?
Part of the answer to your question there is, how can we display to them a robust pipeline that makes it interesting for them to come and do what we want them to do? It's how we influence them. Some of that is equally down to legislation and government, but more importantly, if we can show to those bodies that we're referring to there, and I think there's something like 52 are non-public, and there's the 2 that are public. If we can demonstrate to them that we as GM are only interested in renewable energy, and we in GM are only interested in certain aspects, that comes down to buying power. If we can then couple that with a pipeline of projects which is very clearly defined as this is what we need to do to meet our objectives, they can make an investment choice. Those that want to be influenced by our needs will come to the table and will want to have that open discussion and will want to negotiate with us. Those that don't, unfortunately, will have their own investment track and will not come. But we shouldn't be focusing on those that don't want to come to GM. We should be focusing on those that do. We should be focusing on our needs. What are the needs of Greater Manchester? What do we want? There are 54 plus companies out there. Not all of them will want to come to GM. I'm sorry, that's a fact of life, I'm afraid. But there are a number of entities which are coming to GM and saying, we would like to offer you this. We appreciate that you're going to have to put some money in to make this demonstrator work, but we want to work with GM to facilitate the transition that's set out on the board. But again, not everybody does.
Okay, thank you very much everyone for that. We'll wrap that item up there and move on to item 7, which is the GMS 6-monthly update on performance and implementation plan. We have Anne Morgan and Steve Fife with us today, both again familiar faces to this committee. This was the item that was received under separate cover, so this was received earlier this week, Matt, I think, a couple of days ago. And before we invite them to introduce the report that they've got here, or the appendix that we've got here, this came out, this is with data as at the end of March, and it obviously takes some time to put things together using data or using items as at the end of March, and we are only now on the 11th of April. So one of the things I think we should probably think about is the timing of when we have this report in future. What I think this committee probably wants is a good report, not a very speedy report. And I think if it means waiting a month or another 2 months to have a really detailed report, or a report where officers have not had to hustle to get it ready on time, I think that probably needs to be thought about a little bit. We don't need it in April, I think, in future, unless the meeting is right towards the end of April. I think just thinking about some of that. So please go ahead and draw our attention to anything you think is a particularly important item in here, or anything you think we should be paying particular attention to.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, a little bit more time might have been ideal, but we go with what we've got. So it's quite a broad set of issues, and it kind of hammers home the scope of this committee's work, really, in looking at this, which breaks things down into convenient little boxes, which are not always easy things to put into convenient little boxes. I suppose that the eye is naturally drawn to the ones that aren't green, and the first one there would be sort of mine in housing world, and Paul earlier described the situation in relation to the housing deal and where we are with government on that, and that has altered the situation from where we were hoping to be.
I've had a request to ask you to speak slightly more loudly,
Sure.
please. Thank you.
See if that's better. Yeah. So yes, Paul earlier discussed the situation we are in with government in terms of the housing deal. Better? How about that? Excellent. Okay. Yeah. So we are with government still talking about issues around the housing package and different ways of approaching some of the things that we're hoping to get out of that. What that means is we've kind of stalled some of the work that we were hoping to have boxed off by now, in terms of governance arrangements and so on that were sort of integral to that original housing package proposition, which we're still uncertain about, but we're hopeful that we'll make some different ways to make progress. And then I guess the other one that leaps out is the waste stuff, which I would say I know very little about, so I wouldn't pretend to offer the committee an expert opinion on that. But I'm sure colleagues would be happy to come and explain where we're up to there. But clearly there's been some delay in terms of national strategy, but some of the local work is sort of in train with that. So yeah, but we can come back to the committee with more detail on that if that's of interest.
Thank you. I think you make a good point about the broad range of topics that fall within the remit of this committee. Just on the housing package, I'm interested to learn if we've had feedback from government on why they made the decision they made and what could be done differently or what we've learned from that.
It was quite a simple conversation in a way, in that they were looking for a number, and the number that we were proposing through GM Spatial Framework to deliver was not the number that they were looking for, in order to justify the investments they sought for through the housing package. So we're still talking particularly to Homes England about the support, because clearly government still has that agenda of encouraging and supporting us to deliver, and everyone else to deliver additional housing numbers and the numbers that are set out in the spatial framework. So it's trying to stitch that together in a way that provides some of that support and investment that we're looking for from government, without that kind of very simplistic deal almost of this number means that amount of investment, that the housing packages, plural, not just ourselves, were based on.
So were any agreed to?
As far as I'm aware, the only one that's definitely in place is the one that Oxfordshire have signed up. I know colleagues in West Midlands had hoped to have one signed up, and as far as I'm aware, that's not been agreed. And we're not clear whether there's still progress being made anywhere on these arrangements now.
I'm sure this isn't the only area of government where progress is perhaps a little slower than some people were planning. Councillor Robinson, you were next.
Thank you, Chair. You're talking about Oxford, you're talking about where they put this money down south. How far out were we with regard to numbers for not getting it, or did not give us that reason?
They have given us that reason, and the number that they were looking for us to sign up to was 227,200, which was the number that was in the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework 2016 consultation version. That was based on, at the time, our understanding of what our objectively assessed need was. Since that time, government introduced the local housing need methodology, which should be what we're using to calculate our housing need. That's what we've used in GMSF 2019, which is about 201,000. So the gap is around 27,000 units, and it's the 227 that government are saying we should be providing for. And I think the rationale is they're looking for 300,000 per annum. If you add up all of the local housing need methodology number, that gets you to about 270,000. So they're looking for housing deals to make up the gap between the local housing need methodology and the 300,000. And the rationale being they'll not give us additional funding to deliver what we should be delivering anyway. We have to be showing that we'll be delivering a higher level than that.
Councillor Clay.
So, is there no evidence, or is there no sign from them that they're willing to provide additional funding to help us get to that number? Is that still? Are they basically saying you will get that number and then we'll give you the amount of money that we said we might give you, or are they just? Is there any scope that they will provide additional funding if we commit to that number and seek to justify that through a revised plan?
It strikes me that possibly they're moving away from this number equals this amount of resources relationship. I'm not sure that's necessarily proved successful for them, in pursuing those discussions with local areas around England. So it seems to me we're getting into a different kind of conversation, partly set out in the Homes England strategic plan that they produced a few months ago, which included a fair amount of discussion of the relationship between Homes England in their kind of housing delivery capacity for government and places, as they called it, places around England, including combined authority areas, that alongside the kind of standard programmes and their investment in land, they would have that additional kind of work stream within their forward programmes. So that's still not fixed, as I understand it. Homes England still working on how that's going to roll out, but it seems from the messages we're getting that should be becoming clearer quite soon. So we're hopeful and have reason to believe that Greater Manchester will be pretty high up on their list of places that they want to have a sort of practical relationship in terms of housing delivery with. So yeah, hopefully that will become a clearer picture over the next few months.
Just because it's something that's, I think, is problematic and has annoyed me, that there's been a succession of different housing ministers who don't seem to be around for very long. Has there been any noticeable change in the messaging when you get a new one? Has there been any continuity? Is the continuous change problematic, or is it just, is there no discernible difference in what messaging you're getting when you get a new one?
Tricky question for me, I guess, as an official. Yeah, there can be a difference, and we had a particularly fruitful set of discussions with the last but two housing minister about what we wanted to do and the place-based approach that we wanted to take, and clearly since then that's not progressed as far and as fast as we would want, and as I think he at the time would have wanted. So undoubtedly, speaking as an ex-civil servant, when ministers change around, then things sometimes get better and sometimes don't, but change per se is not always a good thing in terms of political leadership. So yeah, it can be unhelpful in that quite often we're part of a kind of northern, if you like, or an urban campaign almost to educate ministers and civil servants about the particular circumstances and challenges that we face in places like Greater Manchester. And when those faces change, then sometimes you feel like you have to go back a couple of steps in that kind of informing process, shall we say.
Councillor Walker.
Yes.
With your microphone, please.
Do you want me to start doing it for you?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, if you don't mind. So I accept you said you didn't know much about the waste issue, but I noticed that in particular there's two items which we talk about Euro, the last two items on the highlighted yellow bit, the Euro Ignition project, I was wondering what that is, and European funding, because both those sound like they might be in great danger unless they're going to whiz them before, you know, the end of whatever new date we've got. So I was just trying to get a picture of, well, one of them, because I don't quite know what it is, but the other, you know, if those are considered to be milestones, it feels like they might not be.
Sorry, Councillor Walker, I'm probably best placed to answer the one about the UIA. UIA is Urban Innovation Action. It is European funding under the RDF as the overarching piece. The particular call there, Ignition, is about innovation projects around green infrastructure, so i.e. green walls, green roofs, and how we can use what has previously been coined sustainable urban drainage systems to support our environment per se. So as we're moving towards climate change and mitigation, we need to obviously look at how we can adapt. So green roofs and green walls will be critical to that, but primarily it's about bringing a pipeline of projects together and then looking at the investment readiness of those particular projects. And that's what this innovation funding is looking to do, is to develop those projects and get them to a point where investors, not just public but private as well, would invest in them and take those forward at scale. The funding has been secured, so the project is, off the top of my head, I think it's a 3-year project, and that is secured. That's done. We won't be losing that money. That's ours, as in Greater Manchester's and the many numerous partners involved. But that is being ran from the team that I'm based in, alongside Environment Agency and many, many others.
Clear, even if we're out of Europe, they're still going to fund it. I mean, that sounds great news. It just, I mean, good old Theresa, she obviously got a deal for Greater Manchester, but, you know, I'm struggling to understand why they'd want to maintain it after we've gone.
I can't comment on Theresa May's deal making. All I can say is the contracts were signed prior to the deadlines which were set. There are arrangements which have been put in the public domain that state that anything signed and agreed before that given date is underwritten, etc. So I can confirm that is the case.
Okay, nobody else has indicated that they've got a question or a comment on that. Just from me on the format of this, I guess this is a more streamlined version of than the annual report that we get. But I think it is useful to have a halfway marker of where things are up to. So I think it is a useful report. One thing I would like for next time, it talks about comment on the second column in, comment on assessment of GM's ability to achieve 2020 action. Some of those are not completed, and I know that it was a rush to get it done, but I think it makes sense to just, even if it's a sentence or just on track for the green ones, and then one sentence for those that aren't green. I think that is useful to give a high level thing. Councillor Robinson, is it about this report?
Yeah. Yes, Chair. It's on the Go Neutral work completed March 19. 11 business cases produced. Can we have some samples of that at all, please? How the business cases were done?
Again, that's myself. Go Neutral is one of my direct projects. It was off the back of the 2018 Green Summit. Arup very kindly stepped forward and said that they were willing to conduct some work pro bono. It went out to all districts. All districts were asked to come forward with sites or land which was capable of supporting generation, storage or heating assets. Not every district came forward, but a number of districts did, and a number of business cases were put forward. Of those 11, they're all with 4 districts as it stands now, of which unfortunately Rochdale isn't one of those. And they are basically looking at primarily, if memory serves, brownfield sites which are not due to be developed on, are capable of supporting some form of generation asset, but still has a part to play with allowing access and so forth. If case studies are wanted from that, I can speak to the respective districts and see if they're happy for something to be provided back here at a later date. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Okay. Next item is number 8, which is the work programme. It's, of course, for the new committee in the new municipal year to determine its own work programme. And so the only thing really on future meetings is the work programme. One point I would make, though, is that the meeting we had last time and the item we had on transport innovation, I think, was a really useful introduction to the topic and a really good starter. And I'd really hope that the new committee decides to put that on and to look at that in a little bit more detail. There'll be some clear highlights that we've seen lots of around housing, around GMSF, we're fairly sure will come back. And there are other items around transport, and I'm guessing buses will feature on here somewhere, bus reform, but it is for the new committee to determine what is on there. We have a couple of items that are just for our information only, items 9 and 10. One is about an update from TFGM on Transport for the North, and it talks about HS2 and various other things, and then there's the Register of Key Decisions. So with that, I'll declare this meeting closed and mention that the next meeting is the 11th of June at 10 o'clock in this room. Thanks very much, everybody.
Just thank you on behalf of the committee for your stewardship over the past 12 months, and those